This is a D6 generation pip. One of those dots on the side of a six-sided die. Yeah, a pip. A short pip. Little something. About anything gaming related. Sometimes featuring Craig, sometimes featuring Russ. We'll see what's coming up today.
All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to what are we up to? I think we're on the fourth installment of GM Academy. I'm not 100% sure on that. And we're going to talk to John Wakelin, if you're on the Patreon, and if Russ puts up the video for this, I'm not really sure if he does or not. You're seeing John Wakelin, who's the brother of Russ Wakelin, our DM. We're going to do a brief introduction to John, and then we're going to talk about specific world building and whatever other topics we want to talk about. So welcome, John. Glad you could be on this part of the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you bet. Give an introduction to who your character is in the campaign, and then we'll go from there.
So in role-playing a 8 charisma, I play Thrallrick Earthborn, or Thrallrick Frostbeard, otherwise called Thrall, although my name is probably mispronounced a bunch of times by Joe, because that's the way he rolls. So I play Joe's dwarven brother in the campaign.
And I don't know if we covered this in the air. Did we cover how you guys created, or how you created the brother rivalry?
Yeah, well, I don't know if we talked about that either, but
so tell everybody what it is in case they haven't listened.
Right. So I think because Joe and I have gamed together quite a bit and played a lot of D&D together, my brother didn't want us. I don't know if he just didn't want us. He wanted to handicap our strategies and our normal way we play and stuff like that. So, or throw a new wrinkle into the way we play. We both love dwarves, and he happened to pick dwarves because some of the campaign is based around a dwarven connection, and the dwarves players happened to be the ones that left the campaign. So that's why we ended up with both dwarves, and to be tied to kind of the background of what's going on in the campaign, we needed to be from the same clan. But so he threw in the monkey wrench that we are indeed brothers, but we don't actually get along. So we have to argue. We can't agree with each other. He put in a game mechanic that if we actually agree with each other, we actually take a point of psychic damage. So
I didn't realize that. I didn't know Russ foisted that upon you as a game mechanic to try to.
Yeah. Well, he said, so the mechanic didn't happen until like the first session. He didn't say he was going to do that game mechanic. That just kind of.
No, I mean, even just him thinking it through. I didn't realize that.
He definitely came up with the idea, that little quirk, that we would just be two brothers that argue a lot, which is fine because Joe and I can pull that off pretty easily. But then the actual mechanic part of the psychic damage, I think he just came up with on a whim as we were playing. I mean, I don't know that 100%, but that's the way I think it. And then he just decided that it worked well and that we should roll with it. So
I thought it was either you or Joe, or together you created it. That's neat.
Nope. And Joe and I, much like you, which I learned in our other campaign we played together with Doc, that you're a big fan of, or maybe I learned it in our Players Academy, but you're a huge fan of dwarfs, and especially dwarven clerics. And Joe and I are big dwarven cleric players too. So it was kind of, I'm playing a druid, which isn't that far away from one, and Joe's playing a paladin, which isn't that far away from a cleric either. So I love
anything dwarves. In the other campaign I was in pre-COVID, I play a dwarven female thief rogue, and it's super fun to do.
I mentioned this in our Players Academy. I'm trying to play, especially since they dropped all the race/class restrictions with 5th edition, and probably actually earlier than that, but I'm trying to play every class as a dwarf at some point.
Oh, no kidding. Okay, yeah. That's cool. I love it. All right. Well, thanks for that backstory. And what was I going to say? Oh, I was going to say on that, though, I think you and Joe really do a good job. So any players out there, this is GM Academy, so it's designed for GMs, but obviously players listen to this too. So if players are, want to listen to how they do it in such a way that does not stop the game flow or become annoying or hard to do, or Like, John, how this might be a good GM topic you can talk about, actually. How, John, there can be the paladin in the group or the cleric in the group, and then you've got the rogue or the fighter that has intimidate as a bunch of skills. And then there's the party scenario where they want to talk to the barkeep and the fighter wants to grab him by the shirt and threaten and intimidate him and punch him a few times. And the cleric's like, I won't allow that. And then there's like a big fight. So my point to that is you two don't do that. You have a way of doing that oppositeness, but it never seems to impede gameplay. And then the second question I'll ask you is as a GM, but answer the first part. Like, how do you actually do that?
Well, I think this might have been covered. I'm an avid listener of the GM Academy because I like it. I like to pick up things. And so even though one person that's been interviewed a lot is my brother, I actually learn stuff from listening to you guys talk about it. So I enjoy that. And so one of the things that might have been mentioned is part of also being a successful GM is having players that allow you to successfully GM with you. They're not fighting against you.
It's a good point.
Because if you get players, I played in college with people I don't know that well, but most of my life I have played with people that are also my friends and that I know pretty well. I'm playing with new people that I didn't know in the game we play and in Doc's game. But I find that even if you're trying to play different characters that have different motives and different alignments, to use that term, and different things, if you have players that are willing, the actual players are willing to work with each other, and to the end of creating a great story, then they're not going to do things that are diametrically opposed just to do things that are diametrically opposed. And so I think Russ knew that we wouldn't do that. We would have fun with it, and we would want to challenge ourselves and play it the way that he envisioned it, but at the same time, not make it a roadblock to the campaign progressing. And so I think that's why I just think, Joe, like I said, I don't know if I could start out probably if with somebody I didn't know doing that, and maybe things would work out well, but then you might step on each other's toes just because of things you don't know about each other. So,
yeah,
but I know, and everybody tries to role play and not get their emotions involved. But at the same time, what makes role playing fun is you kind of are getting your emotions involved. So, but with Joe and I, we're not going to offend each other, and we know that at this point. So it really doesn't matter what we say, and I think that's just a comfort level.
Yeah,
so I think that as to bring it back to GMing, I think that was a smart move on Russ. Like he didn't ask, Seppi and I to do that because I don't really know Seppi that well, or ask Doc and I to do that. You and I think we could have got fine with that. We have a history, so I don't think we would have, we would have known. But so stuff like that. So that's a smart GM move, and to as part of the GM Academy, that's a mechanic. I don't know if it's been spoken of yet in the GM Academy that Russ came up with.
No.
So if you have two players that are just really good at working together and combat wise and everything, and you want to challenge them so that so you don't have to worry about them. And I don't think it's a bad thing that if we work together, but it's kind of cool because it's opened a window for you as another player and Joe to create that tactical bond, because you're having Euphemia create that tactical bond with Joe, and I'm not the one. And we kind of do some stuff unspoken which kind of makes sense if we're related, even though we don't like each other. We kind of understand how each other fights because we're supposed to have a history together and that. So that makes sense, but it also just opens up windows. And that's one thing you try to avoid if you don't know players, kind of like Survivor or something. You're trying not to set up little pods of alliances that were, especially like you said, if you have people with different agendas and you have the paladin and the clerk that are lawful against the thief and the necromancer, let's say, who have kind of a different morality. You don't want those guys, bumping heads against each other. So, and creating and so I think that was part of all by design by Russ. So
that's a good observation. Yeah. I like it.
It was clever. It's not something I necessarily would have thought I would have thought of. I kind of just would have let, I always let things kind of fall into place, but it's another tool for the toolbox as a GM that, we talk about in these academies that you're like, oh, I could just to throw a wrinkle in it. You think of wrinkles of, like background wrinkles of individual. And that's kind of a cool one that it ties players together, but at the same time doesn't make it so that it kind of sets a boundary almost for them to argue and to kind of have fun and have the character confrontation, but at the same time you're also working together because we have a common goal and we're family, even though we don't like each other or don't get along, I guess is the best way to put it.
Or just counter each other. Yeah.
Right. So it adds another complexity and a neatness to the game. So
yeah, I love it. Well said. Let's go to the heart of today's topic, and then there might be some random topics I already thought of on GMing. So Russ, as you've said, you've listened, has talked a lot about how he GMs with the source materials.
Right.
And Russ has been saying for multiple times, like, you really ought to talk to John, because John tends to DM, or maybe all the time we'll hear from you, DM without source materials. So I'd like you to maybe start with your history of like, why did you do that? And then you'll either answer some of the questions I have inside my head, or I'll just throw out some particulars.
Sure. So I was never really, when I was younger, I didn't really think about world building. I tried to use Greyhawk at times and different worlds that built, but I'd also, when I would try to DM when I was younger, I just kind of created small scenarios around a small area, maybe a town or something. And we often didn't get that far into the expanse of the world just because we were younger and things. But then when I started playing with this, a really good friend of mine when I was in high school, the funny thing is I thought he created his own world, and it was Joe and I. That's how long Joe and I have been playing, my brother and another guy named Derek. And we were the players under this guy named Tovar. And so we would play in his campaign, and everywhere we went with his description and everything, I was just always amazed with how he had all this description and how, like, I felt I could go anywhere, and he was prepared and had all this stuff. And it just was like, and I never thought I could do it. And so it was just like, I felt like anywhere, like the cities and everything, they all had their own character to them and all this interesting stuff. And to be honest with you, when I was younger and tried to use modules, now this was before, at least I wasn't aware of any campaign books. Like, so what Russ runs is a lot of them now. And my son's running one for us, and we've run some other ones and these are campaign books that take you like 1st to 10th level. And I've really only dabbled in reading the beginning of 1 or 2 of those. And my problem is, and I do this in video games too, is I'm a completist. So when I see one of those books, I feel like I have to do everything. And I don't want to do any, I don't want to ruin any plots or anything. But one of the books I looked at that it starts off where you're prisoners, one of these new campaigns for the Drow. And there's 12 NPCs with you. And I'm like, I feel like I'm an accomplished DM. And I'm like, how do you play 12 NPCs and try? And you're trying to remember, and they give you personalities and backgrounds. And because the way my mentality is, I want to play them all perfectly to the book, as opposed to what I have in my head. And so that's why, I think I clung to world building and tried to go down that avenue more, because I didn't feel it as intimidated, because I felt it was my world. I couldn't screw it up because I built it, and whatever happened to it. And so I didn't have to create. And what I learned, so the first time I tried to build the world, I spent an entire summer. I was in high school, and I'm like, I'm going to build this world from scratch. And I always start with a map, and I just love drawing world maps. And so I draw a map, and it's just kind of like, I'm going to put a forest here. And I usually try to figure out the scale based on, how far I know the distances in real life to like Concord, New Hampshire. We're from New Hampshire or something like that, And so then I build the world based off of that. And then I start. So the original one I did, I actually designed a map for each city. And what I did is I built half a world, and I had this border thing between it. And I decided the theme for the other half of the world and put down the cities and stuff, but never really built them. Never went into detail. And then what I learned from that experience was, so I built these things and I put all this time and effort into it, figured out the leaders and all this stuff. And it was great. And it was fun. It was something I did in my downtime. And then I played a pretty extensive campaign with it, and multiple campaigns in that world. But what I learned as I moved to the other side of my world is that I didn't really actually have to create everything ahead of time. And that is the secret, I think, to the whole thing. You can have ideas about it, But the coolness is you really don't need to create it until the party goes in that direction.
I can picture what you're saying.
So it seems like you have this insane, fantastic world, but really what you have at the beginning is an outline. And like, if you're thinking of like a story you're getting ready to write or something like that, you have a title, you have some chapter ideas, and then you have like bullets of ideas inside those chapters. And so that's kind of how you make the world, is you have these ideas. And the current one I run is this, my idea was I wanted to have all these individual kingdoms based off of different cultures in our world, and also based off of different races in the fantasy world. And then I decided there was this overall theme going on. And that's generally, so what I do is when I build the world, I decide there's an overall thing going on. Like in the Lord of the Rings, the overall thing going on is, Sauron is back in town, and he's showing up. So that's the overall thing. But what I decided also as a world builder is as whatever campaign starts, I like to come up with a general idea of what's going on. And another trick, I think, to the trade is not only not trying to design everything at a time, but starting small, especially if you're starting with first level players. You design an area in a city, if you want it to even start in a city, or you design a small town outside the city, or you design a prison camp if you're going to have them all started. And again, you just detail build that area, but you don't have to attack anything else until the players give you an idea of where they're going or what their mindset is and what their direction. And often that'll take you in a completely different world. So in the latest one, what I did is I had my Joe's kids and hadn't played before, his daughter and my son's girlfriend. These are all teenagers. They wanted to play. And so I said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in my world because I know what's going on, but I'm going to put it in an area that I've never done because this will force me to develop that area. And so I put it in the ocean area, and I said, they can't really run away. So they were conscripted by these guys in my world that I call the Jaegers. So they're like monster hunters. And they work for this one kingdom. And so when they find out there's something going on, they conscript players was what it usually, but they conscript adventurers to come with them. And, it was a seafaring thing. So I kind of threw in that some of them were conscripted because they were just so drunk, they ended up on the boat because they couldn't say no. And so kind of stuff happened like that. And so we didn't know if this was going to be a one-off or not. So I kind of put together what I thought would be, his first level. And it would be, like an extended day's worth of playing. So like a 6 to 8 hour session. And we would hang out, and if they liked it, they all liked it. I had a storyline to keep going. If they didn't all like it, it was a kind of a complete story. And it was about these fish people, which Koatoa attacking merchants or whatever. And so the twist I put into it, so they were with this Jaeger called Markwell. And so another thing about world building is names. People always struggle with names. It's easy now. There's so many name generators. It's crazy. And so I used to take names from, like, I'd flip through when we had phone books back in the day, and then I would separate names and reattach them. And I literally would spend just watching TV or whatever. And you could do this too, if you still wanted to, just make up a list of names. And the other cool thing about this is if somebody says, oh, what's the bartender's keep's name? And you didn't think of it, you just check the next name off the list and just throw it on, oh yeah. And you don't have to look it up or anything. You just have this list, and you can do it with a name generator now. You can just generate a bunch of names and then have a little notebook next to you when you're playing, or if you're doing Roll20, you can have a drop down thing with it, but you can have it. So if somebody asks you a random name, you can make one up, and it's not like, cause we all have tendencies. So if you're stuck making up a random names, your name starts to stall down the same.
Right. All right, let me pause you there. I got a handful of questions about what you've already just said.
Sure. I tend to ramble, so you'll have to rein me in.
That's right. That's my job as the interviewer. So all good so far. So I want to start with solo world building back in the day. I too have very fond memories. Let me go back before that. This is one of the areas that is fun in DMing. So in case there's any brand new DMs out there or GMs out there thinking like, I can't create a world. that's kind of what we're going to go through is like John can say, you don't have to have 20 years experience. I'll have John go through how, the first 3 steps to do. We'll handle that next. But one of the fun things I always found about D&D is you can have some fun with it by yourself. I can remember very fond. It's one of these days today. That's why it's on top of my mind. I used to go up to a cabin with my parents up in Canada. Okay. And remember, I'm of the generation where there weren't any iPhones and there was only 3 channels on the TV. And we certainly didn't get TV up in a cabin. Translation. And our parents didn't entertain us 24/7. So there's only so much swimming you can do. Translation. There's a lot of time by ourselves. And I would open up my D&D books and I would just make a dwarven character and I'd make a whole backstory where I didn't do too much world building. I would more just have adventures of the characters inside my head. So John's kind of also reminiscing about that. And John, I have a question for you just on that. And then I got other questions.
Sure.
Do you think it's still fun today? Like, is your son as the GM, is he world building? Like, I'm wondering, is some of that mystique and mystery and funness gone because of electronics?
My son just stuck his head in and shook it. No, he's not world building. He loves his fun. He loves every character he's ever played since we were little. He does a voice with, how we do accents and stuff.
Yeah.
His original character, main character, the Dragonborn. So if you're a listener of the campaign we're in now, there was a statue that was torn down. That was actually my son's character and his first major character.
I think that's super cool.
And he talks like Batman kind of. So, there's those kinds
that's
of things.
awesome.
Yeah. So there's those kinds of things he likes to do. There was a time he was trying to talk. It was awesome where he would have his helmet on. So he was using a hollow Pringles can and talking into it when he was playing his character. It was phenomenal. So stuff like that. And then Russ is his uncle. So of course, Russ ended up getting him a Batman mask, but that's a whole nother story with the volume thing and everything. But yeah, so stuff like that. So that's Devin's motivation as a DM. So every DM has a different motivation. He does create and add characters he runs the modules like his uncle, like Russ, but he'll add characters and put things in, and he likes to really work on the personalities. And again, I don't really have enough experience with those to know exactly, like I can never tell, which is awesome with Russ. I can never tell what he's added and what's part of the book. And I don't really care, which as a player, I don't really know. And I don't care. And that's what's awesome about it. I love that I can't tell. And so, some of those characters added in. And so you can add stuff. And so if you're a person that doesn't like to make the framework of a world and doesn't like that aspect of it, then
it's done for you.
But you like running all the different personalities. That's kind of what Devin likes doing. He doesn't like spending his time on the world. But I like.
Yeah, tell me what you like and what you think is fun.
What I do is I love coming up with a concept and building around it. But the one thing I also love about building a world is, and I didn't originally start this way. I was like, I'm going to build this world and this way. Is when I started playing with players, especially experienced players, and they started asking me things or reaching out that their goals, their characters wanted, things started getting created because of their ideas. And like I say it now, like I want to start a new game with just my brother, another friend, and Joe, and it takes place in more of an Arabic type area where they are in my kingdom, which I haven't explored yet. And it's called the Sands of Kasan. And so they're playing character types I've never played. And they're like, well, I want to play this character that comes from a temple that specialized in training, blade singers, which are these new wizard type classes. And so I'm like, all right, let's do it. Let's come up with some names. Let's do some things. I'll and then I'll figure out where to. So they give me some stuff to work with. So I know, and then I just kind of build it out. And so I've always been very creative with that thing, but you give me a couple ideas to work with. Because if I'm left to my own designs, it might get stagnant. So it's really cool when somebody adds something into the pot, and you start being like, oh, that's going to be really cool. So some of the best stuff in my world was created by the players or given the idea by the players that, like Russ's first character in that world wanted to be a way watcher. And so my world has a lot to do with planar travel and these things called ways or gateways. Because of it, I maybe never touched that or got involved in that, but that was something a character was interested in. And it turned out that another character was a shadow sorcerer. So she was in touch with the shadow realm. So, now we're adding more to the realm. And then another character had the similar thing. So now I'm making all these attachments, and I'm like, all right, so that's going to be heavily involved in what I'm doing.
Okay. Yeah. So player feedback.
It goes back to this saying too, when I'm recording. That's my daughter visiting. But yeah, so it comes back to the small bites. They say there's that saying, how do you eat an elephant? Or some people say, how do you eat a whale? I don't know what the actual one is, but it's one bite at a time. And it's the same thing with building a world. If you're looking at a world as this giant thing you're going to build, you're going to intimidate yourself for the most part. And then, and if you're trying to, write the entire language for a race like Tolkien did and all that craziness, you're going to get intimidated, And so, and the nice thing now too about world is there's so much resources because of the, internet. I mean,
where do you think somebody would begin? What would you say is they're listening to this and they're like, I want to try it?
Usually, so what you do is you have an idea, and that idea can be anything. It can be like a city that you just have imagined in your head, like a floating city, whatever it is, a city in the clouds that's run by cloud giants, but you want your players to start there. All right. Maybe they're overlords and your players start as, they're being, like in a city that's downtrodden, or maybe they work for the cloud giants and the cloud giants use humans to, or some race to infiltrate or whatever. And you can party, or they send adventurers, you can be endless things, but
it sounds like the first thing you do is you have your cloud city. And then the question in there is, well, why would my characters be there? Why would my characters be there?
Well, as the DM, it's just like a module. In all of these modules, your party starts somewhere. So, I mean, you want to give your players freedom, but at the same time, they have to start somewhere. So a lot of times with these games, the world creating also, it can be anything. It can be, you can start with a city and that's all you have. Your entire adventure could take place in Waterdeep. If you created an idea similar to Waterdeep, if that's what you want to do, an entire city adventure. But it's going to be kind of around what you want, an ocean adventure. Maybe you just decide you want to have these cool islands with all these different themes to them. So you make an island hopping adventure, and you start with one island.
Do you have you ever heard the thing that a story should have a beginning, it should have a middle, and it should have an end?
Yes.
Do you think of that beforehand, or do you just think about the beginning?
So I usually don't start with a map. Map's one of my favorite things to do. What I usually start with is an overall theme that's going on in this world I'm going to create. And then I decide where the characters are going to start and if I want them to have relevance to the overall theme. And what I usually do is I don't...
Wait, let me pause you. Is the theme the floating city, or is the theme Save the Princess?
So the theme, I think, would be in the case of the floating city.
Let's keep the floating city.
Yeah, the theme would be in case of that. The theme, I think, would be that giants have overtaken the world and that they rule everything.
Okay.
And in this case, it's cloud giants. And so you start, so if you want your players, one of the things I'm very cognizant of is obviously first level characters aren't saving the world. They're potential heroes. That's the way I look at it. They're potential heroes, but they have choices and they're going to do what they're going to do. And they're doing what they could do. And this is what's cool about an open world as opposed to a module, is they could join the giants, and the fun part of the role playing is them working their way up into the ranks of the giants' services as minions if they want to play evil characters. Or they could be working against the giants to free everybody under their suppression. Or, they could be just meddlers in the world, like Ocean 11's type people stealing from the noble rich people under the giants, or the giants themselves eventually. And you have to pick you have to come up with something. And this is where the creative part comes. So if you're not good at coming up with a storyline, or often I build things basically just off an encounter that I have in my head, like a cool encounter. I like cool encounters too, where everything's not just here's the bad guy, here's the good guy, bang, and you smack heads. There's something going on within the encounter itself, whether it's a heavy fog that's blinding it or, whatever the case may be. There's multiple levels to the combat because you're on different bridges so sometimes you just build it around that. So you have to have a small concept to work with to begin with. It could be a concept. Your concept can be anything though. Your concept can be I have a concept how I want to get the characters together. Like, for example, in that module or in this floating city we're talking about, they're all prisoners, or they all started in the same neighborhood and they're all street urchins that know each other, whatever the case. And they now obviously they're not kids anymore because nobody wants to, unless your players want to play 12-year-old kids, but for the most part, people want to play young adventurers and so maybe they've grown up together and they've gotten training in varying ways. And the other thing that's cool is you can present that to your players. You give them a little bit of structure when they're doing their background, saying, okay, here's the background. You're all starting out as street urchins that knew each other, but then you kind of separated. And I'm going to have you, I've got the way I'm bringing you back together, but you guys just figure out what you've been doing for the next 5 years or whatever. And they can write up backstories and stuff.
Question 2.
Sure.
Let's stick on the Cloud City.
Sure.
Do you recommend players? Is this when you build half of the city? Like, do you start to draw up buildings and where's the barracks and where's the Lord live? And what do you do next? And then there's all those NPCs to fill. Right. And how do you handle that? So usually what I do is if you can create it contained as much as you want. So if you're starting them, if they're starting as prisoners, they're going to start in the prison, let's say.
Right. If they're starting as prisons, you only need the prison and the immediate NPCs that they would run into. But like any story, and again, I assume the modules work this way. I haven't used one of these campaign modules, but there's hooks. You have to have hooks. And so when you, as a DM, you provide hooks. And what I like to do as a DM is so there's a main path that you've created. That's a real obvious thing. So the real obvious thing is that everybody's being suppressed in this kingdom. And the real obvious bad guys are the giants and perhaps their minions.
I have to pause you on that because that's brilliant. That's where I fail as a DM that's brilliant. That's why I want to pause on it. So what John's saying is always have a really obvious path.
Yeah, there's the if you want to look at it as a tree, there's the trunk. And the trunk should always be there because the last thing, this is even in the earliest campaigns that I ran in, as much as I loved the world of the DM, sometimes we as players, there wasn't enough hooks for us or breadcrumbs, and we would be like, what do we do next?
Yes.
And that's the worst thing that can happen to your players.
I do that.
They're standing around going, what do we do next?
Because I keep thinking that advanced players are going to be so bored with the standard plot hook. Right. But actually, we're not bored at all. It's super fun to know where the blazing red trail is. Then we can decide if we want to do. So I just wanted to pause on that.
I'm 100% with you as a player. You want to see the main path ahead of you. And then as the DM, you make a main path, and I think Russ has mentioned this too, or I think the books, but then that's when you start dropping breadcrumbs or creating hooks that create branches and open up doors of opportunity for your players to go in directions of their choice. And that's where it becomes the kind of make your own adventure story. And sometimes the best part happens when a player has a really clear idea of where they want to go with their character. And they're like, I'm looking to, they start asking questions of an NPC or somebody you have hooked. And suddenly you see them creating their own door or their own hook or their own branch, whatever you want to call it. And you're like, all right, well, let's explore that door for the player and see if they drag the other players with them in a good way. They guide the other players. And then what I like to do, this is part of world building, but also it's kind of a teaching of characters is, and Russ does it some too but I love to have the characters make in-depth backgrounds. And then what I love to do is add hooks or breadcrumbs that link to their backgrounds, that stuff they've created in there. So it's now it's something that's personally invested to the player, but you can even easily tie it back to your main tree trunk or a part of your tree trunk or part of something else that another player involved them in. So you start like looping everything back in and creating branches off of that. And before you know it, it grows from the seedling, to use this tree thing that you created with this main trunk, into this giant tree of all these branches that, you know, that created. Maybe they go on an offshoot and leave everything behind, but that's their choice. And if you want, if they broke out of that in some violent manner as players, maybe they've angered the giants in the case of the thing. And so they're constantly being hunted by the main plot, even though, and maybe eventually you drag them back into that plot, or maybe they just manage, and maybe the whole campaign is about them figuring out ways to avoid these guys and creating their own fortress or hideout or whatever, and avoiding. And I love that stuff. I mean, and so I remember, and one thing Russ said, and my only contention to one of his things he said, that one of the reasons he liked the modules is because he doesn't feel like violated is a strong word, but he doesn't feel like they violate his world or whatever if they add something that he wants to create in the world or change his world. And I would argue, as the way I create worlds, I'm leaning on the players to add stuff to my world and make me think of things I didn't think of. And I love it when they create things within my world, like this tempo. I love it when they give me ideas that make me go, oh, I'm going to add this. And this is a thing I came up with too, for all you older DMs who have kids, and like you who have younger kids, if you wanted to create a world, make a small campaign thing. And sometimes these, you know, one-off campaigns don't last very long or go very slowly because you can only play. And I just started this. There's a couple of campaigns I've made when my kids were younger, and I created material, and Russ brought this up too. And I created just kind of an island things were about. So I didn't have to create a world. I just had this tiny little island. It was actually a city called Haven, and everything was branched off of this little city port Haven in this island. Well, as I was thinking about it, as I was moving forward, I'm just going to put this island in my world. It's there now, and it's part of my world, and it's all been built because I spent, you know, hours playing with my kids there. So it's this detailed map I created that I just created as I needed it. And that's my secret, is creating thing as I need it.
That's what I want to go back to. So let's pretend
you don't need a map to start with. You just need an idea.
That's what I want to go back to. Let's pretend we're in the Cloud City and they're in the prison. And let's say you've got that, you know, the NPCs for that, and you've got the, you know, the players, and you sprinkle in some hooks, and the main hook is meet the Cloud Giant King and save the princess. Okay. What do you do when I get it when Russ said they pop out of the prison and they create a doorway as you've described it.
Right.
And it's the end of the session. That's perfect, because now you can build that.
Right.
What do you do if somehow that happens really early in the session? So they're going to go jump down a doorway that you're like, wow, super cool, but haven't created it.
Yeah. So that you have to, you have some responsibilities when you create these things to be prepared as possible for the doorways. Like,
okay,
you got to know if you in the particular vision of this prison version of what we're creating here, you have to come up with the 3 or 4 different ways that you think that they're going to break out of the prison. And, you know, could be through the sewers. So then you got to be prepared for a sewer map. But I played with a DM that I thought was incredible, because I could never tell, but this person created I can't do this. They created everything on the fly. And I did learn from them, though, that you don't need a map for everything. So let's say they go down the sewer and you didn't think they were going to go down the sewer. Well, they just need a way to get out of the sewer. And sewers are a lot of T's and right angles, and, you know, like, so you don't, and if they go back into the sewer, they're probably not going to go back through the prison. It doesn't, so you could just do a line map as you're going on a piece of paper and create T's. And then if you wanted to create the encounter there, then you just draw out where like an intersection is. And I mean, originally, you know, you might have an idea what a sewer looks like. You know, it's got water in it. It's going to have walkways on the side. You just make an encounter area, and you have the crocodile there. And like, I do the exact same. That was one of the things when Russ said it on the Academy. I do the exact same thing Russ does. I always have 3 or 4 random encounters ready.
Okay.
Just in case and I make them around the thing. Like, so one of the random encounters could be a patrol, you know, just a city guard patrol. And so I always have, whenever my characters are in cities, I always have a city guard patrol because you never know what your characters are going to do.
What do you have the patrol do? I find cities the toughest to GM because of those guards, frankly. They always want to fight and kill the guard, and I never know what to do.
Well, that's on the players some. And so you got to have the players that you got to make sure your players understand that there are consequences for that choice. And that's a whole adventure on its own. If they attack the city guard just to attack them, well, one, you have kind of random players that are just into randomness. So that's something that you've gotten yourself into with those particular players. So you're going to have to, now your world building may not be as important because now you just got to figure out, because it's going to basically be about hunting these characters, or maybe the whole thing's going to be about them avoiding what they did and cleaning up after themselves. And that's a thing too. Okay. And then you could have investigators, that hunt them down or whatever. So that's going to be something that you necessarily didn't prepare for, but that looks like, that's if the campaign is what those characters want. And we've talked about this as players. I, as the DM, usually talk to my players ahead of time to try to get an idea of what they're looking for. If they're going to be thieves and cut purses and everything else, you got to be prepared for that stuff's going to happen. And that's the type of campaign you're playing.
That's a great point.
You got to, if you're a DM that's not up for that, you just tell them I'm not looking to run something like that. You have to be prepared. So like when I come up with an idea of what I want to play next, I usually reach out to, and usually the players I know, and I reach out to them and say, I have an idea and this is kind of the campaign I'm looking to run. Are you interested? And so I've kind of set the table a little bit of what I'm trying to do.
That's subtle. So, I didn't think of that. That's a great point.
That's another tool for a DM is if you have an idea, and that's kind of like, it's the same idea as a module thing. You're like, I'm looking to run, what's it called? The Cult of Tiamat. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but or I'm looking to run, there's an apocalypse one, an elemental apocalypse one. Or I'm looking to run the Mines of Phandalin, so they know what they know what they're getting themselves into. And so there's, as we talked about in the Player Academy, there's onus. The players have to be responsible too. Otherwise, it's not going to be fun for anybody. And so if you've got players that are just tacking the end, the shop keep and everybody just randomly, I don't enjoy that as a DM. And I'd be like, look, this isn't the campaign I'm looking to run. So that's the way you guys want to roll. That's not going to be fun for me. So maybe one of you guys should DM if that's the way you want to do it. Especially if you have a younger group and you all just play together. I mean, that would be my answer to that too. If you just have people randomly hacking people down, kind of trust my players to not just, because they also know, because the other quick way to do that is especially if they're first level, if you have these random encounters, set up for the city guard and everything, and they do something silly like that, maybe they just get themselves killed. And you've taught the players, okay, that's not going to work in John's worlds because you're just going to get yourself killed. Okay. So, you kill off half the party. The other half is in prison. You say, okay, so you guys are spending the rest of your life in prison. Let's start a new game. It's like, it stinks, but it's a good lesson to learn that you can't just attack whoever you want in the town. So,
okay.
And so you try to impress that upon the players to begin with, But okay, so let me give you a little tip about world building. One of the things I do now, because of the resources available, is I just go on to Google and I say D&D map of Port City. And then I do images. And you get hundreds of images, and I just pick one that I like. And this is good to not have a preconception of something too much. If you have a preconception of what you really want, like this floating city, although I guarantee you can find a map of the Cloud City too, but if you want it to be exactly to your own specs, but don't exactly know how to make a map, then print out a city map that's already done and just make sure you include stuff to that and see what the scale looks like. Because you could even put in a population you want, and there's going to be a map available. Trust me. And so you could use it as a kind of a framework to create your own world if it doesn't meet what you need. Otherwise, like for now, like I said, and when I was younger, I just kind of created, this is another trick I did. I create the center of the city, and just in my mind, it's more expansive than that, but I don't really need to know everything. I just need to have a description of how it, and I try to pick a style of what kind of, and I use cultures or fantasy things that I've seen of how the city generally looks. So you kind of got to have a theme of if it's really built up like it's a bunch of shanty shacks, or it's tall, thin, elven towers, or whatever your general theme. It's on the cliffside, so and it's it overlooks this cliff, and it has a giant castle in the background.
Okay,
and what the material, the predominant material is that's built up in the city, so that you can give, because description. I'm not a writer by any stretch of the imagination. I tried writing once, but one of the things I do is you don't need, and everybody's probably read this. Some people will take an entire chapter. I'm not naming names to describe the whiteness of the whale, but you can also just use a few lines to get an image across. And so you don't, because of that's the whole range. As a DM creating your own world, that range exists for you too when you're describing your city. So you don't have to, if you're not a super detailed person, and players will create images in their mind. And just like when you read a book, yours and my image will be different, but that doesn't matter. As long as they have an image of what's going on and they know what's in front of them, to the right, to the left, and behind them, those are basically what you're kind of what you need to know as a player. But your image of the tavern isn't going to be the exact same of my image of the tavern. And I will fall back.
I would argue that that's part of the fun.
Yes, exactly. And there was a tavern in this game I've been playing recently, and it's these Jaegers I mentioned before. They're all hunters. So I said, you think of the tavern Gaston is in Beauty and the Beast. It's got all the heads. It's got the large chairs with the horns on it. And so sometimes I'll fall back on modern culture to get the general gist of what's going on, and then throw the details. So I don't you can spend, and like you said, if you want to spend your personal time doing this and spend hours, putting into description of a place, that's open to you. Or you can spend just kind of bullet points. I'm a big fan of bullet points, like things I read down as I describe a place instead of writing out and this is another thing that can be daunting writing out paragraphs of description. You don't have to do that. You can just do bullet points. That kind of if you're describing and then focus in on something, like the tunnel doesn't matter as much as the intricate door with the symbol of the spider on it and the 8 eyes is each one's a gem. Those types of things is what you can focus on, because the players, too much description, this as a player, goes over your head a lot of the time. It's really just the important things in the room that really, that you need to know, or in the city. And so one of the things I do ahead of time, so I print out this map, and then I'll pick a couple places in the city, or I'll look for the obvious place in the map that's the merchant's quarters, because the players always want to know where to buy stuff. There. And so, like Russ mentioned this in the other one, you pick a place, you pick a couple features of the shopkeeper, personality, big nose, whatever you want to be, just to make them a little memorable. Whether they're a haggler or whatever, because I'm not as a player, I'm quite all right if the DM says, if I say I want to pick up some, armor, if the DM goes, okay, it's whatever the cost is in the book, just you go to the merchant.
Yep, fine.
Because I don't have to role play out all my merchant encounters, but some people love that. And so, and I learned that with my kids, with my brother, they, and his kids, some of those eat those up. And so I'm like, all right, so you got to have some of those prepared. You don't have to prepare the entire city, but just particular sites. Cause they're going to be like, well, where's the nearest smith? And I'm like, Fire Shield Smith is over here, and it's in this part of town. You have a little description on the way there, and then they go there. You have a description of the sign, what the inside looks like, and it's all focused on the merchant and the interaction with the merchant after that. And then so you just again, you bite it off in chunks, but you have to have. So you got to think ahead a little bit. Yes, you have to have some planning ahead. You can't. But
what would you recommend if you're brand new? Would you just railroad them a little bit and say?
Well, what you do is, again, it depends what you want. The thing you don't want to fall into is you don't want to have an entire story from beginning to end figured out, and this is the story you want your characters to do, because it kind of works with D&D. But players don't generally like to be railroaded.
They don't like that. Yeah.
And I maybe I could be accused of that on occasion. I guess I try not to do that. I try to open it up, and I try to present. I really try to present obvious opportunities for the players to make choices to change the direction of the campaign. And sometimes if they stay along the plot, I don't know if I'm just really good at putting out breadcrumbs that people like, or if I'm almost forcing them too much. I don't know. I've never had any complaints in that direction. Excuse me. But sometimes you feel like, wow, this is going exactly how I thought it would go. Am I really forcing them down a path? Because again, another example in that one that I was telling you about, that was a one-off, they decided to keep playing. So I actually kind of had it way it set up. It directed them toward this island because their ship had been, it turned out the Jaeger wasn't really a Jaeger. He was a pirate that had taken over the Jaeger's personality. And so what I wanted to do, because I wanted them to keep wanting to keep playing, the last visual they had after this successful adventure was they woke up the next morning kind of after partying after the thing. And their ship had been scuttled. They'd taken the rudder, and this pirate ship's next to him. And they thought the guy had died when they were under the water doing this thing with the Coatoas, but he was really going after this treasure and using them. And so there he's on his boat, and he's like, doing the Captain Morgan stance type of thing. And he's like, thanks for, all the treasure, nothing personal, and then sails off. And, Joe's character is like, well played, Captain, well played, but they're all angry. So they want to get back at
they want to get their revenge
guy eventually. And that's another thing when you create your own world, and the modules are pretty good at this too. You don't want all your bad guys to get away, but you want certain ones that can reoccur and be in the backs of your players' minds, because the campaign could entirely turn into just hunting that person, and which is cool, if that's what they want to do.
To your point of not building the world out too much, because if they just want to do that, you now build this whole other thing.
That's a really, really good point on your part. If you get too far ahead of yourself, then you could get bitter if they don't go in that direction.
Right.
Because you're like, I built all this stuff, but if you only build as they go, then you never really get bitter, because you're building in front of them. You're creating pathways, but you don't create your pathways too deep. And really, the worst case, think about this as the worst case scenario that happens to you when a player makes a decision that you really weren't prepared for. And this is the really worst case scenario, and you don't want it to happen, but you're like, gee, that's awesome, guys. I really like that, but we'll end the session here. And so I can prepare for that next time and really lay out ahead of where you guys really want to go. That's the worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario. And it's not even that bad.
And you don't want to say that, but it was like Doc had to say it to us one time, and it was our own fault. We said we were all going in this direction. And then we find out we're actually passing the island. And he's like, ooh, I didn't really research that island yet. We're all veteran players. We've all tried to DM probably at one point or another. None of us are like, wow, you're a sucky DM. We're like, all right, we passed the island and we leave it as we go by.
It wasn't even that bad, to your point.
You're all trying to have fun. It is what it is. And so in worst case scenario, and especially if somebody does something really off the cuff, and you know what you can do is you can you just kind of go on the fly and take notes as much as you can, but there's going to get to a point where you don't want to ruin the experience because you just don't have anything prepared. And if you have good players and understanding players, it's let's say I don't know what other games you play. If you're a Magic player or you have a lot of board games, you say, all right, we got a couple hours left. Let's get a pizza and let's play a board game, and I'll work on this for next session, instead of, creating something. And if they're good players, they'd rather that you. Now I've never really had to do that. I don't think that I've known them or you, like with my family, you only have so much material prepared and you're like, let's play for a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours, and then we'll do something else. And then if it ends early, nobody complains, or if it runs over a little bit, nobody complains, but you kind of know. And then Russ is right about that. 2 hours is a little short for me because I feel like we get rolling and then we end, but I like the 3-4 hours is probably my favorite window right now, because when I used to play, when we were in college, you don't see each other except for vacations. So I'd have to build like 6-8 hours worth of material. Everybody's crashing at my house. I'm up at 3 a.m. writing new material so that we can play another 5 hours.
That's tough.
And it's fun, but it's also like, you're just like, going 100 miles an hour. And so the short sessions, but we only played once every 6 months and you want to play as much as you can. Whereas where if you have a regular weekly thing, and I did this in college sometimes, and we only played like 3 or 4 hours. It was really nice because you're like, because Russ is right about this. Characters will do things, players and they'll do things you never think of, which is really cool. And you thought you had a really cool way to handle it, But the fact that they didn't get to the end of your material gives you an opportunity to beef up your material even more and come up with really cool ideas. Like, again, in this latest campaign I was playing with the kids, there was this summer soiree that with the family members from the backstory of one of them. And I had it all planned out, but we didn't get there. And I was like, oh, this gives me a whole couple of weeks to try to really flush it out, come up with some other ideas, think of things I didn't think of, So it's just it's planning ahead in bite-sized amounts.
All right. We got 1 minute left before we're done recording. Do you have the 1 minute GM wrap up?
Yeah, just, the best, you're going to have the best experience as a GM or a DM if you have good players, because they'll understand where you're coming from, and they'll be interested and open to following the breadcrumbs and looking into the world that you create. So it's really about having good players and good friends to play with.
I think that's a really good point that wasn't covered in any of the previous ones, is to think about the adventure you're running, and that you as the GM allow yourself to be at the one you want to run in the world that you want to run, and then invite the players that you think will want to do that too. And it's not wrong to not do that, but
like our example one, I came up with this really cool idea I want to do with this floating city adventure. You guys interested? That simple.
Right. All right. Thanks, John. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me.
And you're welcome. And I'll see you in a couple hours for our next recording of Roleplay 8 Charisma.
All right. Take care.
Now, a brief word from, me. Hey there, fellow gamers. In my day job, I work with many solopreneurs, and I find that they face 3 typical things. We want to increase revenue, want to get more free time, but not just free time, they own their own business. We can take free time off whenever we want, but stress-free free time. And to work on the business versus in the business. I help with just that. I get business owners to have the stress-free free time they really want, increase revenue and on a consistent basis, and gain real traction to work on the business versus in the business. If you want to know more about that, the easiest thing to do is follow me on Facebook or subscribe to the Raef Granger podcast. Or if this is speaking right to your heart and you're like, that's me, well, go ahead and email me directly, raef@raefgranger.com, and we'll brainstorm where you're at. If you're here for the gaming content, well then stay tuned. I've had several listeners reach out to me and ask for more, quote, Raef-style content, kind of reminiscent of the old-style Hollywood minutes, where people would hear what I was up to gaming-wise. So I'm looking forward to recording those, and we'll post them up here on the D6G feed. Until then, see you later, and happy gaming.
Achievement unlocked! You've made it to the end of another D6 Generation episode, the podcast whose humor has universally been acclaimed as not too horrible. Please let us know what you thought of the show by emailing us at info@thed6generation.com. If for some inexplicable reason you actually enjoyed this show, you can help others find out about it by leaving positive reviews on iTunes. Thanks for listening and happy gaming.